He rescued the alien warrior from chains. Now she moans his name in her sleep. The neural dampeners hummed with a low, agonizing frequency that vibrated through the very marrow of Quorra's bones. Yet the heavy thud of a kinetic explosion silenced the drone for a fraction of a second. She felt the ship groan, the metal screaming under the pressure of a breach that shouldn't have been possible in the vacuum of the nebulous sector. "Stay still, I'm coming for you," a voice rasped, cutting through the haze of her delirium. Quorra blinked, her vision clearing enough to see a silhouette framed in the orange glow of the thermite-scored doorway. It was a man, small by the standards of her people, but possessed of a terrifying, focused energy that seemed to bend the air around him. Arlo moved with a fluid, predatory grace that ignored the gravity plating's failure. "You are human," she whispered, her throat dry as stardust. "I'm the guy with the bolt cutters," Arlo replied, his hands already moving over the locks of her shackles. He didn't use a slicer or a digital bypass. Instead, he applied a localized heat torch to the stress points of the alien alloy, his muscles tensing under a tactical vest that was covered in grime and soot. Quorra watched the way his brow furrowed, a bead of sweat tracing the line of a jaw that looked as though it were carved from Terran granite. When the shackles finally hissed and fell away, her body slumped forward, her strength depleted by weeks of torture. Arlo caught her, his arms wrapping around her waist with a firmness that sent a jolt of heat through her cold, blue skin. "I've got you, Quorra," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "Why would you risk your fleet for one prisoner?" she asked, her fingers clutching his shoulders. "I didn't bring the fleet," he muttered, hoisting her into his arms. "I brought a plan," he added, kicking a piece of debris out of his path. The corridors of the Hegemony ship were a labyrinth of shadows and red emergency strobes, but Arlo navigated them with a terrifying familiarity. He didn't look at a map. He felt the vibrations of the ship's engines through his boots, calculating the path of least resistance. Quorra pressed her face into the crook of his neck, the scent of salt and gunpowder filling her senses. It was a visceral, biological smell that her species had long ago engineered out of their own bodies, and it stirred something primitive deep within her core. "They are closing the blast doors," she warned, sensing the shift in the ship's atmospheric pressure. "Let them," Arlo said, his grip tightening. He didn't slow down, even as the massive slabs of durasteel began to descend. Instead, he reached into a pouch on his belt and threw a handful of magnetic pucks into the gears of the closing mechanism. The screech of grinding metal echoed through the hall as the door jammed, leaving just enough space for him to slide through with her in his arms. He landed on his feet on the other side, his chest heaving with exertion, but he didn't put her down. "You humans are reckless," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and sudden, inexplicable arousal. "We're just very good at breaking things," Arlo countered, a smirk playing on his lips. He ducked into a maintenance shaft, the space so tight their bodies were forced together in a friction-heavy embrace. Quorra could feel every ridge of his abdominal muscles pressing against her stomach, the heat of his skin radiating through his thin undershirt. Her species, the Voltorians, valued distance and mental clarity above all else, but in this dark, cramped space, she felt the logic of her culture dissolving. "Your heart is racing," she noted, her hand sliding down to rest over his chest. "That's what happens when you carry a beautiful alien through a war zone," Arlo said, his voice dropping an octave. "Is this part of the human tactical manual?" she asked, her eyes searching his in the darkness. "No, this part is just me," he whispered, his gaze lingering on her lips. The air in the shaft was thick and humid, filled with the sound of their synchronized breathing. Arlo shifted his weight, his thighs sliding between hers to find a better purchase on the ladder rung. The contact was electric, sending a wave of moisture to her hidden depths that she had never experienced before. She let out a soft, involuntary moan, the sound echoing in the narrow space. "We need to move, Quorra," he said, though he didn't pull away. "The extraction point is only 2 levels up," he continued, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw. "Then why have you stopped?" she challenged, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Because I've wanted to do this since I saw your file in the briefing," Arlo admitted, leaning in. He kissed her then, a hard, desperate collision of mouths that tasted of survival and raw hunger. It wasn't the polite, telepathic exchange of her people. It was a physical claim, his tongue sweeping into her mouth to tangle with hers. Quorra arched her back, her fingers tangling in his short, dark hair as she pulled him closer. The sheer audacity of his touch, the way he handled her as if she were a prize he had fought the entire galaxy to win, broke something inside her. "Arlo," she gasped, pulling back just enough to breathe. "Save the gratitude for when we're off this bucket," he said, his eyes dark with a heat that rivaled the thermite he'd used earlier. He began to climb again, his movements even more focused than before. They reached the shuttle bay just as the Hegemony guards arrived, their plasma rifles glowing with lethal intent. Arlo set Quorra down behind a stack of crates and pulled a compact kinetic rifle from his back. "Cover your ears," he commanded, checking the chamber. "I can fight," she insisted, reaching for a discarded stun baton. "I know you can, but right now, I need you to stay alive," Arlo said, spinning around the corner of the crate. The sound of the human weapon was a rhythmic, punishing roar. While the Hegemony used elegant, silent beams of light, Arlo used mass and velocity. Every shot found a gap in the alien armor, the physical impact of the slugs sending guards flying backward. Quorra watched him with a growing sense of awe. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a force of nature. He moved through the crossfire with a terrifying lack of hesitation, using the environment to his advantage in ways her people's rigid combat doctrines would never allow. "The shuttle is prepped," he yelled over the noise of the battle. "Move now," he added, grabbing her hand. They sprinted across the bay, the floor beneath them vibrating as the ship's internal stabilizers began to fail. Arlo practically threw her into the cockpit of the small, unmarked stealth craft before diving in after her. He slammed the hatch shut and hammered the ignition sequence before the guards could even reach the boarding ramp. "Hang on," Arlo grunted, pulling back on the flight stick. The shuttle jerked upward, the inertial dampeners struggling to keep up with his aggressive maneuvers. They cleared the hangar bay just as the Hegemony ship's secondary reactor went critical, the resulting explosion painting the stars in shades of violet and gold. Arlo didn't look back. He set the course for deep space and leaned back in his seat, a long, shaky breath escaping his lungs. "We're clear," he said, wiping a streak of blood from his temple. "You are hurt," Quorra said, moving toward him. "It's just a scratch, Quorra," he dismissed, but he didn't stop her when she took his hand. She looked at the red fluid on his skin, so different from her own pale ichor. It was warm, vibrant, and filled with the life force of a species that refused to be conquered. She leaned down and pressed her lips to the wound, a gesture of healing that was also an act of submission. "You saved me," she whispered against his skin. "I told you I would," Arlo replied, his hand finding the back of her neck. The silence of the deep space transit settled over them, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. Arlo kept his hand on her neck, his thumb tracing the sensitive skin behind her ear. Quorra felt a strange, humming vibration in her chest, a resonance that usually only occurred during the Voltorian mating cycle, but here it was triggered by nothing more than a human's presence. "Your people will be looking for us," she said, though her voice lacked any real concern. "Let them look," Arlo said, pulling her onto his lap. The flight deck was small, the light from the consoles casting long shadows over their intertwined bodies. Quorra straddled him, her long legs wrapping around his waist. She could feel the hard evidence of his desire pressing against her, a physical promise that made her breath hitch. "I have never felt this," she confessed, her hands roaming over the scars on his shoulders. "This isn't Voltorian protocol," Arlo murmured, his hands sliding under her tattered tunic. "Protocol is for those who aren't alive," she countered, leaning down to nip at his shoulder. Arlo let out a low growl, his fingers digging into the flesh of her hips. He didn't wait for permission. He stripped away the remnants of her clothing with a frantic efficiency that left her shivering in the recycled air. When his hands finally made contact with her bare skin, the sensation was so intense she nearly blacked out. He was all heat and friction, his palms rough but his touch incredibly precise. "You're beautiful, Quorra," he said, his voice thick with need. "Show me," she pleaded, her head falling back as he buried his face in her chest. He moved her with a strength that was effortless, his mouth finding the sensitive peaks of her breasts. Quorra cried out, her nails digging into his back as he teased her with his teeth and tongue. The pleasure was sharp, almost painful in its intensity, a human brand of passion that demanded everything from her. She felt her body opening up, responding to him in ways she couldn't control. "Arlo, please," she whimpered, her hips beginning to grind against his. "Not yet," he whispered, his hands moving lower. He found the slick heat between her thighs, his fingers exploring her with a curiosity that was both clinical and worshipful. Quorra felt like she was being dismantled and rebuilt, every nerve ending firing at once. When he finally entered her, the sensation was a physical revelation. He was thick and unyielding, filling the void she hadn't even known existed. "Oh, stars," she gasped, her eyes snapping open. "Look at me," Arlo commanded, his own eyes burning with a fierce light. He began to move, a slow, deep rhythm that felt like the pulse of the universe itself. Quorra clung to him, her world narrowing down to the friction of their bodies and the sound of his ragged breathing. This was the human secret, she realized. It wasn't their technology or their tactics. It was this raw, unadulterated connection that ignored logic and survival in favor of something far more potent. "I am yours," she sobbed, her climax beginning to roll through her in waves. "You're mine," Arlo agreed, his voice a guttural rasp. He accelerated his pace, his thrusts becoming faster and more urgent as he neared his own release. Quorra felt him shudder, his entire body tensing as he poured himself into her. She held him tight, her heart beating in perfect synchronization with his, until the last of the tremors faded away. Hours later, as the stealth craft glided through the void toward a secret human outpost, Quorra drifted into a shallow sleep. Her head was pillowed on Arlo's chest, the steady rhythm of his heart acting as a lullaby. In the quiet of the cockpit, she began to murmur, her voice a soft, melodic trill. "Arlo," she whispered, her lips curving into a smile. Arlo, who was still awake and monitoring the sensors, looked down at her with a softness he rarely showed the world. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, his hand lingering on her cheek. "I'm right here," he said, though he knew she couldn't hear him. But Quorra was dreaming of the moment the shackles fell, of the heat of his skin, and the way he had looked at her like she was the only thing in the galaxy that mattered. Even in sleep, the human had claimed her, and as she moaned his name again, she knew she would never be the same. The peace was short-lived. A proximity alarm began to chime, a shrill, insistent sound that shattered the intimacy of the cabin. Arlo was instantly alert, his hands flying to the controls before Quorra had even opened her eyes. "We've got company," he said, his voice flat and professional. "Hegemony?" she asked, sitting up and pulling her tunic back on. "Worse, bounty hunters," Arlo corrected, pointing to the sensor screen. 3 small, high-speed interceptors were closing in on their tail, their signatures jagged and aggressive. They weren't looking to capture, they were looking to disable. "The cloaking device is failing," Quorra noted, her eyes scanning the diagnostics. "Then we stop hiding," Arlo said, a dangerous glint in his eye. He flipped a series of switches, rerouting power from the life support to the rear thrusters. The shuttle groaned, the internal temperature dropping rapidly, but the ship surged forward with a new, desperate speed. "What are you doing?" Quorra asked, gripping the arms of her chair. "A little human trick called the slingshot," Arlo explained, his hands dancing over the flight stick. He headed straight for a nearby gas giant, the massive planet's gravity well pulling at the tiny craft. The interceptors followed, thinking they had trapped them. But Arlo wasn't running, he was building momentum. He skirted the very edge of the planet's atmosphere, the friction turning the shuttle into a streak of fire. "We are going to burn up," Quorra shouted over the roar of the atmospheric entry. "Trust me," Arlo yelled back. At the last possible second, he fired the nose thrusters, using the planet's gravity to whip them around and back toward their pursuers. The sudden change in direction caught the bounty hunters off guard. Arlo opened fire with the shuttle's limited forward cannons, the kinetic rounds tearing through the lead interceptor before it could even raise its shields. "One down," he grunted, rolling the ship to avoid a return volley. The other two interceptors broke formation, trying to flank them. Quorra moved to the tactical station, her fingers flying over the Voltorian interface she had jury-rigged into the human systems. "I have a lock on their engine signatures," she reported, her military training taking over. "Feed it to my HUD," Arlo commanded. With the data from Quorra, Arlo became an artist of destruction. He performed a series of high-G turns that would have killed a Voltorian pilot, but the human's reinforced skeleton and stubborn will kept him conscious. He picked off the second interceptor with a precise shot to its fuel line, the ship blossoming into a brief, violent fireball. "The third one is retreating," Quorra said, her chest heaving with adrenaline. "Good. He can tell his friends what happens when you touch my cargo," Arlo said, finally leveling the ship. He looked over at her, his face covered in sweat and a triumphant grin on his lips. Quorra felt a surge of pride so fierce it caught her off guard. This man had fought gods and monsters for her, and he had done it with nothing but a metal box and a stubborn refusal to die. "You are a terrifying species, Arlo," she said, her voice full of wonder. "You haven't seen anything yet," he promised. They reached the outpost, a hidden base carved into the side of a barren moon, without further incident. As the shuttle touched down in the pressurized hangar, a team of human medics and soldiers rushed forward. Arlo stepped out first, his hand extended to help Quorra down the ramp. "She's a high-priority asset," Arlo told the lead officer, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "And she's with me," he added, his hand remaining firmly on the small of her back. Quorra felt the eyes of the humans on her, a mixture of curiosity and respect. They knew what Arlo had done to get her back, and in the human way, that made her one of them. She was taken to a medical suite, where she was given a clean uniform and a meal that actually had flavor, a luxury her people had long ago abandoned. That night, as she lay in a soft, human bed, she found she couldn't sleep without the sound of Arlo's breathing. She stood up and walked down the quiet corridor to his quarters, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. She didn't knock, she just opened the door and stepped inside. Arlo was sitting at a small desk, his shirt off as he cleaned his rifle. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening instantly. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, setting the weapon aside. "The silence is too loud," she admitted, walking toward him. Arlo stood up and met her halfway, his arms sliding around her with the familiarity of a longtime lover. He smelled of soap and the faint metallic tang of his gun, a combination that Quorra found intoxicating. "I think I'm ruined for my own kind," she whispered, her face pressed against his chest. "The Voltorians are a bit stiff," Arlo joked, his fingers tracing the curve of her spine. "No, it's not that," she said, looking up at him. "It's the way you look at the world, Arlo," she continued. "Everything is a challenge to be overcome, a law to be broken," she added. "Even love?" he asked, his gaze intensifying. "Especially love," she replied. He kissed her again, but this time it was slow, a lingering exploration that promised a lifetime of discovery. He led her to the bed, his movements tender as he laid her down on the sheets. He worshipped her body with his hands and lips, finding new ways to make her tremble, new ways to make her forget the cold discipline of her past. "You are the most incredible thing I have ever found in the dark," Arlo murmured, his breath hot against her skin. "And you are the only light I ever want to follow," Quorra whispered back. As they moved together, a slow, sensual dance of skin and soul, the rest of the galaxy faded away. There were no wars, no hegemony, no bounty hunters. There was only the heat of the human and the awakening of the alien. Quorra felt herself expanding, her consciousness merging with his until she couldn't tell where she ended and he began. In the morning, the sun rose over the moon's horizon, casting a long, golden light through the reinforced window of Arlo's room. Quorra watched the light play over his sleeping features, her heart full of a peace she had never known. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, that her people would call her a traitor, and his would see her as a complication. But as she leaned down to wake him with a kiss, she knew it didn't matter. She had been rescued from chains of iron, but it was the chains of human passion that had truly set her free. "Wake up, Arlo," she whispered into his ear. "We have a galaxy to change," she added. Arlo opened his eyes and smiled, a look of pure, unadulterated devotion that made her breath hitch. "Just as soon as I have my coffee," he said, pulling her back down into the blankets. And as the alien warrior laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed through the small room, she knew that humanity's greatest gift wasn't their ingenuity or their strength. It was their ability to make even the vast, cold emptiness of space feel like home. The weeks turned into months, and the legend of the human and his Voltorian shadow grew. They became a symbol of a new era, a testament to what could happen when the rigid structures of the old galaxy were met with the fluid, unstoppable force of human emotion. They fought battles that redefined the borders of known space, and they did it together, two halves of a whole that the universe could no longer ignore. But in the quiet moments, away from the sensors and the strategy meetings, they were just Arlo and Quorra. They were the man who refused to give up and the woman who learned how to feel. And every night, as the stars wheeled overhead, Quorra would fall asleep in his arms, her voice a soft, constant prayer. "Arlo," she would murmur, a smile on her lips. "Always," he would reply, holding her closer. And in that promise, the entire galaxy found a reason to hope.